The voice of Sherry, Durian
The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
And today we are with Professor James Piscatori. He's the head of the School of Government and International at Durham University. Today he's going to talk about Islam, in particular in the region of Southeast Asia. And hi, I just want to say hi to you.
Hello, hi, thanks for having me.
So you've done extensive work in the Middle East, but you also have a lot of interest in the region of Asia, and in particular in this region of Southeast Asia. What prompted you to have to refocus on this region?
My original work was on the Middle East, and of course if you look at Arab traders and various other Arab groups, you see that they traveled and traded to this part of the world, into the Malay world and Southeast Asia generally. And so I was very interested in seeing how Islam in fact moved from, I suppose you could say, the Arab world originally into other parts of the world, and this is one of the ones where they certainly did. And by the time we get to the sort of early modern period and late medieval period, it's well established here. And then in the very present period, in the modern period, Malaysia in particular, but also broadly Southeast Asia, have played an important role in kind of larger Islamic ideas, the organization of the Islamic Conference, etc. So it seems to be growing in importance, and the connections between this part of the world and the other parts of the Muslim world are growing.
If you can categorize the kind of Islamic influence to the society in Southeast Asia, how many waves of, Islam that came to this region?
Well, there are several. It's a good question. There's no clear scholarship on the question of moving here, of the transmission of Islam to here. Some will say it's because of the traders, some will say it's because of the Sufi orders, etc. In many ways, of course, they overlap. And so we have that first wave that occurs, brings through those networks, starts to bring Islam. And then over the intervening centuries, there have been a lot of movement back and forth, in large part because of two things. One is the Hajj, pilgrimage, and so a lot of Muslims from this part of the world would have gone to Mecca and Medina and would have returned and would have been influenced by that. And people in the Middle East would have encountered people from this part of the world where they probably would not normally have. And the second sort of crisscrossing is kind of for study. So many students would have gone not just to Mecca, but Al-Azhar in Cairo, into the other great Arab cities, and also to the Ottoman Empire, to Istanbul. So you would have had in the 18th and 19th centuries a lot of that development going on. In the 20th and 21st centuries, of course, it's a combination of all those. More and more people go to the Hajj, more and people go overseas to travel, to study, and of course tourism has become a big addition to the waves of motion back and forth in movement.
That's very interesting. When it comes to Islam, what is so attractive? Because if you look throughout history, Hinduism and Buddhism, or combination of both religions, seems to be the main religious belief of the communities in Southeast Asia. What made these communities somehow attracted to the teaching or the doctrines of Islam?
Yeah. I think two things. One is the kind of the message of Islam itself, which is actually quite simple and quite attractive. A very clear kind of monotheism and a very clear sort of idea of what should be studied. The Quran is the sort of central scripture, etc., would have been available, and so the teachings would have been clear. And I think that serves as a point of attraction. But you add to that, in fact, that many of the sort of traders, etc., who on their trips, etc., had converted, did well. And because they were successful financially, materially, etc., it would have given the impression that Muslim communities were one that you would quite like to join. And so Islam presented an attractively simple and, in a way, successful image. And so that, I think, would have brought a lot of people to it.
I'd like to introduce Islam, where people generally associate Islamization or the idea of Islam itself either in a more political or economic, or if in a societal way they would associate with Arabization. But I want to go back to the past, like perhaps 100 or 200 years ago. How do communities absorb Islam, but still being able to somehow maintain their culture, their original cultural traditions?
It's certainly a very important question, especially now. So on my visit to Malaysia this time, I noticed the greater concern about Arabization, and many people feel that this is an not necessarily acceptable sort of development. I think you have to take the historical perspective of this, and that would tell us that there have, as your questions were posed, there has been movement back and forth over the centuries, that there have been influences from the Arab world on the Malay world and the Malay world on the Arab world for centuries. And so I guess the core point here is that we shouldn't think of any of these cultural areas as pure, that they're always influenced by cultural influences from other places. So, the term that has often been used about modern societies is that they're hybrids. And so to a same extent, I think Muslim societies are hybrid culturally. So they do have some Arab influences, they do have influences from other parts of the world. As in earlier periods, you also would have had, say, Ottoman, Turkish influences, etc. Persian influences would have come in. And I think that's just all part of the hybridity which would constitute any community, including Muslim communities.
So in essence, when you talk about Islamization, either in the past or in today's Islam, it's more towards the hybridity of different culture, where the community have somehow become Muslim, and they somehow, I would say, export or import their culture to other communities or to their own communities.
Yeah, exactly right. That's how I would put it. That in a way, the normal natural condition of the modern world is of this kind of mixture, of a kind of bringing together of cultural influences. And so it's very hard to think of kind of clear cultural categories anymore. They're transcultural, they're hybrid, etc. That's what now, this is not to ignore that there are certainly organized groups and movements that would have been identified with other parts of the world and have come into various societies. That's a sort of natural development.
We'll take one short break. When we return, we will speak with Professor Jim Piscatori.
The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hi, this is Arlene. You're back with me again on our Durian Heat, where we bring you discussion or discuss on Southeast Asia. As usual, we have Professor Jim Piscatori, Head of School at the School of Government and International Affairs, Durham University. He's an expert in the Middle East and of course in Asia, especially with a focus on Southeast Asia. My subsequent question, we discussed a lot about the history, the complexity of Islam, especially the waves of Islam in Southeast Asia. I want to know why it is really hard for you yourself as well to pinpoint the different waves of Islam that has come to this region, and why it matters to understand about the different kind of Islam or cultural Islam.
I think it's partly because, well, if you compare it with the history of the Middle East, so we know, for example, that the expansion of Islam occurs quite rapidly, and it occurs with the expansion of an empire. So after the death of the Prophet, and there of course is a period of turmoil, etc., but that it quickly solidifies into dynasties and empires which are centered first on Damascus and then on Baghdad. But we see this, so in the first few centuries of Islam, though, basically what we call the Umayyad period, we can see this movement across essentially certainly the Arabian Peninsula and further, all the way up to Persia in the east. And there is this, why did it occur so fast? Well, it had occurred partly because of military conquest. It occurred partly because the establishment of imperial structures of governance, which provided for political stability, so people were attracted to it. And of course, as I mentioned at the outset, the attractive message of Islam would have brought a lot of this, would have brought people in. In the case of Southeast Asia, we know that we don't have such a conscious movement, and of course it's the distance from where the religion began, is in a way. So the complication here is that it doesn't. We see that it spread, but it probably spread because of traders and who would have had some relationship to Islam. So they are the ones that would have, just as one would expect, business patterns, commercial patterns would have brought outsiders into this part of the world, and in so doing they would have brought in other ideas. And so they're not quite as organized as they were. So it's not until we get to the kind of the modern period, really from the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, where we have people in this part of the world responding to larger political and intellectual trends. So some people refer to this as modernism, etc. But they will be responding to that, and so it becomes a little bit more organized. But by that point, most of the work has already been done.
I want to fast forward to the 20th century, because that's where Islam is being associated with political Islam. And since then, when you talk about Islamization, people would think about a certain kind of political Islamic structure that is either positive or negative depending on who you're asking. But what is your thought how the 20th century of political Islam has somehow shaped the kind of ideological Islam that we know today?
I think there's two kinds of Islamization. There's Islamization from above and there's Islamization from below. Now, at some point they can intersect, and they do intersect, but there are two, in a way, the motivations behind them are very different. So let's take Islamization from below. Islamization from below is really connected to what we would call da'wah movements, the call to Islam. And many observers, particularly media representations of Islam, have misunderstood da'wah as a kind of proselytizing missionary directed against non-Muslims. Maybe to a certain extent that has occurred, but by and large the da'wah movements have been directed against fellow Muslims. The point being that you should learn how to read the Quran better, that you should understand the sources, the scriptures, the laws, etc. So it's essentially aimed at making Muslims better Muslims. And in the modern period, it's also been connected with a little bit of some amount of social welfare work. So Muslim communities should not only be more pious, but they should also be helped in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, etc. So the movements from below, in the name of Islam, have had an impact, and that, in a way, has increased identification with Islam. It's increased identification with institutions which have provided for that education, provided for that social welfare. Now, there is also Islamization from above.
You're mentioning it's mainly by governments.
Mainly by governments, and this is there are also, of course, organized political parties, organized political groups, which may say that they're operating from below, but in a way are really top down too. And the governments, of course, are the big part of the story. So, particularly in the latter half of the 20th century, the governments of Muslim countries have taken upon themselves the ability, the role of speaking for Islam and creating institutions which are meant to be sort of spreading the right message, the right interpretation of Islam. That is created a kind of bureaucracy, whose job is to sort of kind of standardize the teaching of Islam, the preaching in the mosques, etc. So that kind of Islamization is, of course, is intended to increase the legitimacy of the government. It could backfire.
When you say the Dawah movement from the top, I'm quite interested in it because, especially in Southeast Asia, I remember reading one of your paper saying that in the 1980s, there's this sponsorship by the Malaysian government as well as the Saudi government to create this network of Dawah movement in Southeast Asia.
Yes.
How does that impact Southeast Asian, especially Islam in this region?
They're a considerable part of the story, and particularly from the 1980s. You're quite right to date it from that. I mean, many people will say the 1970s, but I'd say it's stepped up after the Iranian Revolution with the kind of advent of a very kind of in-your-face Islamic politics. So yes, the Malaysian government, but all governments, would have created institutions which they would say are in the name of Dawah. The Saudis, of course, are particularly very strong on this and have funded lots of groups about this. Well, its effect has been twofold. On the one hand, it has brought people, increased people's understanding of Islam. It has provided as a way of transferring a certain amount of money to various individuals and help the poor to some extent. On the other hand, it has created a kind of an official Islam. And one of the great questions before us today, particularly in a country like Malaysia, is to what extent that official Islam is being questioned by others.
We will take one short break. When we return, we will answer the question that he posed to himself.
I don't know about that.
The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hey, this is Arlene. You're back again with me, and of course with Professor Jim Piscatori from Durham University. It is interesting that you're also questioning your own thoughts about Islam, especially political Islam post 20th century. For non-Muslim and Muslim, like when we talk about Islam, we often say that Islam is a monotheist religion, but we also say that Islam is diverse in the way the followers practice it. But it's also interesting that because of the top-down of the way governments or political parties or political entities try to exert the kind of Islam that they want to promote, Islam has become kind of ideology that depends on which other government that wants to promote it, rather than becoming this diverse religion based on the interpretation of its followers.
I think that is exactly what has happened, and it's been a big problem. What we see is that, as states have taken upon themselves the control of Islam, many of them, maybe not all of them, but many of them have pushed an ideological agenda. Now, in the case of Iran, that would be Shiism. We know famously that in the case of Saudi Arabia, this is Wahhabism, etc. Now, I know many people argue that, and I think this is true, that you can overstate the extent to which these states have promoted or been successful at promoting their ideologies. But I think we don't know, first of all, it's an empirical question. So we don't know how extensive or not that those influences be. But we see it, I think, anecdotally. I think that we have enough evidence to suggest that yes, they do have an influence, that they are attractive in certain ways. The ideas, the ideology is attractive in certain ways. The trouble is that when you, in a sense, promote it, it's tantamount to promoting a political platform.
I want to go further on this particular idea because not to talk more about Islam as a religion, but Islam as a foreign policy mechanism for a nation. Because if you go beyond Islam, let's say I take the ideology of liberalism. It seems to be the core foreign policy for the U.S. to promote towards the rest of the country, towards the rest of the world, because it's also a way for them to say that, hey, we want to create this empire, but of course not the 15th century idea of empire, but more like in today's globalization form of empire. Do you think when it comes to Islam as an ideology, whether it's Wahhabism or Shiaism or etc., it is actually being used as a foreign policy for a country to export their political power throughout the world?
Absolutely. I think precisely. I agree with everything you just said. And I think, as you said in the case of the U.S., for example, I suppose everybody thinks that, the American kind of exceptionalist view of it is exceptionally, the great liberal power, etc. It's all done for solidifying, in a sense, that's a foreign policy aim, which is solidifying the views of various of the regimes themselves. And of course, in the case of the Middle East, for example, you have different versions of it. Nasser, for example, used Arab nationalism in foreign policy as a way of solidifying his power base and projecting the power of Egypt. Saudi Arabia very clearly uses Islam as a way not only to legitimize the regime, but to magnify Saudi Arabia's role or place in the world. And I think other countries have done that as well.
Do you think that Islam is under threat because of it becoming or succumbing to or cease to be an ideology rather than the original Islam that is being practiced for centuries by its followers, which is diverse in nature?
Yeah. First of all, I think that Islam, like any set of ideas, of course, there is the core, as you quite rightly said at the beginning, there is the core, which is unchanging, etc., but there are different interpretations, different sort of modalities, etc. So I think like any set of ideas, there's a certain evolutionary side to it, and so that's natural. that will occur. Is Islam under threat? Uh, One way it could be seen to be under threat is the kind of opposition from outside, the kind of Islamophobic, anti-Islamic sort of stereotyping that distortions of Islam that occur. The danger inside is, I think, follows from what we were saying, this ideologization, if there is such a word. The idea.
You probably will be
I just made it up. But the turning of a faith into an express political platform, which is used to legitimize and use for political purposes. When you do that, you really you are distorting the spirit of Islam.
And to further add salt to the injury, it seems like non-state actors like ISIS is also jumping in the bandwagon by somehow creating this idea that their brand of Islam is the most purest, I would say.
Exactly. And ISIS, of course, in many ways is simply the logical extension of this kind of Wahhabization of Islam. And so, they as a group are doing exactly what I was saying about the established states. They are replicating a state structure and are telling you what Islam is. And they're telling you that this Islam is of a particular kind, but again, it's a very distorted sort of interpretation. And so, yes, I think that's a good example of the great danger that's there.
We'll take one last break, and when we return, we'll discuss more with Professor James Piscatori.
The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hey, this is Arlene. We are back again with Professor James Piscatori from Durham University. So let's focus on Malaysia right now, because when it comes to Islamization, it has gone to a very negative extent that it scares off non-Muslim, and for the Muslim, they see that the goal of hudud law, for example, is the ultimate goal for Islamization. But at one hand, when you look at the non-Muslim in this country, for example, the recent incident where one non-Muslim were asked to wear a sarong, which is actually it's not even an Arabic attire, but to the non-Muslim, it is seen as a form of Islamization. Do you think Islamization in Malaysia has gone to the extent where any form of cultural or culture that is non-Malaysian is being seen as a threat towards this country?
Of course, I don't know. I'm not that familiar with all great detail of what's going on in Malaysia. But I can say this kind of generally, that one of the dangers of a kind of Islamization is there's a whole classic Islamic idea called hisba, which is the idea of promoting virtue, and protecting against vice. Now, that's a venerable Islamic idea and a useful one for any society. When it becomes very pronounced, and it has occurred, for example, where religious police have been adopted by not just the Saudis, by the Nusra Front in Syria, ISIS, etc., then we have the kind of policing of people's morals with the suggestion that their personal conduct, their attire, etc., is related to public virtue. But I think that anybody would say that these are private matters, and when the private becomes taken seen as a danger to public virtue, then I think we're getting into dangerous territory, an unfortunate development.
So in the case of Malaysia, the kind of situation that is happening right now, what do you think that I guess society or the government can do to address this? Because the idea of Islam itself seems to be associated in a very negative term. It's very top down in a way,
Yes.
rather than it's a natural religion for people who want to be a Muslim.
If I had an ideal world, I would want Malaysia to kind of revert to what it was most famous for. Malaysia has always been considered a model in the Muslim world, a model of multiculturalism, a model of tolerance, where all these differences have been accepted, where there isn't a kind of standard model of the Malaysian citizen. There isn't a standard now when we talk of Islam of the Muslim person, etc. I think when you start doing that, you're getting into the very, very judgmental roles, and the judgmental roles of saying that someone is a good Muslim or someone is a bad Muslim can very easily lead to a kind of policing of it. And when that occurs, I think then a society moves towards the level of intolerance. And that's something which Malaysia never did. This is something that Malaysia was really famous for, its tolerance, its acceptance of diversity and pluralism. And so in many ways, if I had a preference, it would be that that's the image and that's the kind of society that Malaysia wants to revert to. And I think it mostly is, but there are stresses and strains which would indicate some worrying developments.
Thank you very much, Professor James.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting. I didn't have the answer to any of these excellent questions. Good luck.